So, petition number P001118, mandatory training for Irish mainstream school teachers' children on spectrum disorders. Before we begin, can I remind members, witnesses and persons in the public gallery to turn off their mobile phones. I would like to welcome and to thank you all for appearing before the committee this afternoon. You were invited here today to discuss petition number P001118, mandatory training for Irish mainstream school teachers, children on spectrum disorders. Josephine Bowles. Notices. I advise our witnesses to turn off their mobile telephones as they interfere with the sound system and will interfere with the broadcasting of the meeting. Before I ask you to address the meeting, I wish to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of section 17(2)(l) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled to thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect a parliamentary practice to that effect, where possible. You should not criticise nor make charges against any persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. I also wish to advise you that the opening statement and any other documents you have submitted to the committee may be published on the committee website after this meeting. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the House or an official either by name or in such a way that makes him or her identifiable. The presentation from witnesses have already been circulated to the members. I remind the witnesses that the presentation should not exceed 10 minutes in duration. To commence our discussion, I would now like to invite Jim to make his opening statement, and then we will move on to Eddie Ward, PO of Special Education Section of Department of Education and Skills, and then Adam Harris from As I Am. When the presentation has concluded, I'll call on members to ask questions. Thank you. Jim.
Okay, thank you very much, Cathaoirleach and members. Good afternoon. My name is Jim Mulcairns. I'm the Principal Officer representing the Teacher Education Policy Section in the Department of Education and Skills. And I'm joined by Eddie Ward, who's the Principal Officer with responsibility for Special Education Section in the Department, and indeed by Madeleine Hickey of the National Council for Special Education, who's in the Visitors Gallery today. So we very much welcome the opportunity to appear before the committee today to discuss the issues raised in petition number P001118 in relation to the mandatory training on spectrum disorders for teachers. To assist the committee, we've provided a briefing note for circulation to members for today's meeting, and that note provides an overview of policy developments and provision in the area of inclusive education and forms the basis of our presentation to you today. I note that the focus on the petition is primarily on the need to educate the educators, and this, Cathaoirleach, is a name that is fully shared by the Department, and I hope to demonstrate today that there have been substantial developments in recent years, both in initial teacher education and in continuous professional development for serving teachers to support teachers' knowledge and understanding of the specific needs of children with special educational needs, including those with spectrum disorders, including dyspraxia, sensory processing disorders, dyslexia, as well as autism and other spectrum disorders. I note that the petition suggests that the desired objective could be achieved by making training mandatory. In his response to the committee on this particular issue in May, the Secretary-General of the Department advised that inclusive education, including the education of children with special educational needs, is already a mandatory part of standards for initial teacher education. The Teaching Council's accreditation process for initial teacher education programmes is the mechanism through which the Council can satisfy itself that the standards are being met through a given initial teacher education programme. The Secretary-General also noted in that correspondence that at present there is no mandatory professional learning required of teachers after they've completed initial teacher education and induction. In this context, Section 33 of the Teaching Council Act provides that the Teaching Council may make renewal or registration subject to having completed an accredited programme of CPD or continuous professional development. To inform and support the development of CUSON, which is the national framework for teachers' learning, the Teaching Council implemented a comprehensive, multi-layered consultation process through 2014 and 2015. Some 5,000 teachers contributed to that consultation process, and the feedback was very rich and helpful in informing the drafting of the framework. The purpose, of course, of the framework is to ensure that there is a mechanism through which further consideration of compulsory CPD or mandatory CPD could be considered. So findings from this particular process identified that teachers are extremely interested in opportunities to engage in high-quality professional learning activities that are relevant to their needs and those of their pupils, and also that enhance teaching and learning in their classrooms. Allied with this deep interest in professional learning is a strong interest in personal development and in types of collaborative learning and professional conversations that take place in schools on a formal and indeed on an informal basis. These findings are confirmed by the strong demand for professional learning opportunities provided by the Department through their funded professional development services, including the Professional Development Service for Teachers, commonly known as the PDST, the Junior Cycle Team or JCT, the National Induction Programme, which is the NIPT, and of course the National Council for Special Education itself, along with other professional learning opportunities, of which I'll speak a little bit more later on. In consideration of the question of mandatory CPD, it would be important to consider any evidence to indicate that a mandatory approach to CPD would enhance teachers' practice and to ensure that teachers are taking account of the diversity and complexity of learners' needs, particularly in a special education context. The evidence gathered by the Teaching Council so far has led it to the conclusion that ongoing learning by teachers should be both encouraged and incentivised so as to ensure authentic engagement in a way that's both sustainable and impactful. Through the CUS-on development process, the Council is exploring with the profession how this can be done. The Department will be guided by advices supported by appropriate evidence when considering the broader question of linking teacher registration to the completion of accredited courses. At this point in time, the Department is of the view that there is much more work to be done before such a move should be considered. In the material provided for the committee, we've included details of provision for professional development, and I therefore do not propose to list all that provision in these opening remarks. However, if I could point you specifically to the supports available to teachers through the National Council for Special Education. The remit of the NCSE is to develop schools' capacity to support students with special educational needs, including those with spectrum disorders, and to promote a continuum of education provision which is both inclusive and responsive. The NCSE is responsible for the allocation of additional teaching and care supports to schools to support children with special educational needs. In addition, the NCSE support services provide additional professional development supports for teachers who are teaching children with special educational needs. In this way, the NCSE fulfills a vital role in enhancing the quality of teaching and learning in the area of special educational needs provision. CPD and other in-school supports provided by the NCSE are designed to enable teachers to adopt evidence-based approaches to teaching students in special and mainstream classes in special schools. The focus of their professional development is on enhancing teachers' understanding of the nature of the special educational need, including autism and other special spectrum disorders, and the learning and teaching implications for each individual student and teacher. Also, to enhance teachers' use of a variety of interventions and teaching approaches for students based on their assessed needs or the assessed needs of the students and taking account of empirical based research. And also to enable teachers to assess, to plan and implement effective and differentiated teaching strategies with a view to meeting the needs of students through individualised planning. And that's something I think we'll be talking a little bit about later too. In relation to supporting children with autism, the NCC Support Service and the Middletown Centre for Autism operate cooperatively around the provision for continuous professional development for teachers in the area of autism spectrum disorders. The Middletown Centre, based in County Armagh, is a joint north-south initiative established in 2007 with funding provided by the Department of Education and Skills along with the Department of Education Northern Ireland. And its purpose is to support and promote the promotion of excellence in the development and coordination of education services to children and young people with autism. There is also a range of other department-funded CPD supports provided through other support services and delivered across the national network of 21 whole-time and 9 part-time education centres, as well as primary, post-primary schools across the country. When designing CPD for delivery to teachers, all of the support services must take account of the needs of all learners, including students with spectrum disorders and all students with special educational needs. So I'll conclude my remarks by thanking you for your attention, and we're happy to answer any questions members may have, and we look forward to engagement with Adam as well. It won't be our first time. I'm sure we'll have a positive
did you want
discussion.
to add anything, or was Jim?
Thank you, Chair.
Grant, just for questions. Okay, well then I'd like to welcome Adam Harris from As I Am to present.
Thank you, Chair, Deputies and Senators. I want to thank the committee for your invitation to address you in relation to the issue of mandatory autism training for teachers. This issue is one which is featured in every submission that As I Am has made to the Department of Education and Skills over the past 5 years. Whether we're discussing the need for additional autism classes, the SNA scheme, reduced timetables, better outcomes for autistic students, or indeed children out of school, the issue of teacher training cannot but be central. It is no surprise to us that this issue has been brought to the attention of this committee by concerned parents, and we congratulate Ms Booles and others who took the initiative to get this matter on your agenda here today. By way of context, I'm the founder and CEO of As I Am. As I Am is Ireland's national autism charity. We are 5 years old this year and endeavour to bring about an autism-friendly Ireland. That is a society where every autistic person is respected and accepted as they are, and has the opportunity to participate in every aspect of Irish life. Central to this aim is an inclusive education system, which universally respects and values autistic students and their unique way of communicating, understanding and interacting with the world. It's important, I think, that we see this as an accessibility issue, and in the context particularly of the discussion around mandatory training for mainstream teachers, recognise that the right to access mainstream education is something enshrined in the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We are presently at something of a crossroads in regards to autism access to education in Ireland. 86% of autistic students who are in school, enrolled in a school, now attend a mainstream school. This is a sea change compared to what was the norm perhaps 20 years ago. Indeed, as a young child, I spent the first 3 years of my education in a special school due to the complete lack of support or knowledge of autism in the mainstream school system at the time. However, it is clear to us that while the quantity of children attending mainstream school has vastly increased, the quality of their experiences is greatly varied, and significant change is required to ensure that every autistic student has a positive, empowering school experience. Sadly, that isn't the case presently, and weekly my team deal with cases of children who are autistic being disciplined for the fact that they're autistic and how they may interact with others, very high levels of anxiety, children who do not have a school place or are on reduced timetables, often because of a lack of suitable teacher training, and a real sense of rejection when a child isn't understood, respected and celebrated within a school environment. In order to meaningfully include autistic students, there are numerous essential ingredients. I think schools must be adequately resourced to do this, and this means they must have access to the staff numbers, capitation and clinical expertise they require to universally include students. And this is a point that is repeatedly raised. The environment of schools must be autism friendly. When we consider accessibility, we often think of wheelchair ramps and lifts. However, we often overlook the sensory needs of autistic students in busy, loud and often congested mainstream school environments. Indeed, even buildings presently being constructed lack autism proofing in their design. School policies must be autism proofed. Policies, for example, which deal with discipline, assessment and enrolment cannot remain in the same as before autism inclusion in schools. They must reflect the specific support needs of a cohort of students who may need to do things in a substantially different way to others in order to get through stressful school days. And this really goes to the culture of schools, right down to the language we use to describe autistic students. Everyone in a school community must be informed and respectful of autism. This includes peers, parents, non-teaching staff and members of the boards of management. Perhaps most critically, all teachers within a school must understand and accept their role in teaching students on the autism spectrum and must be able to access whatever training they need in order to provide a differentiated, accessible education for such students. I've outlined these different issues because it's right that we understand meeting the needs of autistic students as something of an ecosystem, as opposed to any one singular action. Whilst we are here specifically to talk about teacher training today, it's important we also acknowledge the need for the state to do more to support schools. Chairperson, for those who may not be overly familiar with autism, it's perhaps useful to provide a short explanation of the condition and why, as a result, students may need teachers to be further equipped to support them. Autism is a lifelong developmental condition which relates to how a person communicates and interacts with others and how they experience the world around them. In practical terms, this means that autistic students may communicate in a very different way to others. This might include using alternative communication systems as opposed to speech, understanding language very literally, or not using facial expression or body language in the same way as other people. It means that how a student may see detail as opposed to the bigger picture, or may not be able to fill in the blanks in social situations like other people can. It means that a student may perceive their environment very differently to others, and this may lead to sensory overload and significant discomfort. When these issues are misunderstood, it is easy for breakdowns in communication, frustration, or a lack of understanding to occur. Unfortunately, we very often take a deficit approach to autism, when in actual fact, if we accept that autistic people may need to do things differently, we can unlock the potential of students who have a different insight to others and who often excel at areas they are most interested in. Bearing in mind 1 in 65 students in our education system have a diagnosis of autism, and that autism itself is a vast spectrum, with every single autistic person having different levels of needs and different challenges and strengths, it's easy to see that every teacher will encounter many autistic students in their career and will need to have the capacity to adjust their pedagogy and classroom environment accordingly. Indeed, if we think about this from an accessibility point of view, where a teacher doesn't have these skills, school itself is not accessible for students. Many teachers are already doing this. In As I Am, we are inundated with requests from schools to access training and talks during Croke Park hours. The Middletown Centre for Autism is playing a vital role in providing a range of high-quality free training to teachers across the island of Ireland. And we are lucky to meet incredible teachers every week who, through their own initiative, have learnt about autism, played vital roles in ensuring their students can fully participate and succeed. However, ad hoc efforts like this are simply not enough, because this can't be optional, because inclusion isn't optional. The EPSIN Act of 2004 is now 15 years old. If we consider this in the context of a student's journey through school, we're now seeing a generation age out of the school system. It's regrettable that in that time, not enough has been done to ensure that every single teacher knows and understands autism. It still does not constitute a compulsory element of initial teacher education. There is still no mandatory training for existing teachers. Indeed, many teachers assigned to autism classes have little to no training on the condition prior to taking up their post. This is simply a recipe for disaster. It places both students and teachers in an entirely unacceptable position, and unfortunately, many students are being failed today as a result. I'm sad to report that we hear weekly from students who've fallen out of school or who are attending school irregularly, and a key factor to these cases is teachers who are not equipped in meeting the needs of autistic students. Chairperson, this must stop. I would like to make some practical recommendations to the committee today. 1. Initial teacher education. We believe autism training must form a compulsory requirement of initial teacher education. This is in line with recommendations already made to the Department and the Teaching Council by the National Council for Special Education. As I have explained, autism is in many respects counterintuitive. As a result, it requires teachers to have a discrete knowledge of the condition, which in turn may improve their skills as a teacher overall. Mary Immaculate College, Thurles, has taken the first steps in this direction. I would encourage the committee to learn more about their rationale for making this decision and to encourage all other initial teacher education institutes to follow. 2. CPD programme. There is a need for a national programme of training for all teachers in autism and other disabilities. We need to get beyond the concept of autism being the purview of any one teacher, but rather it is the responsibility of every single teacher in every single school. We welcome that teacher unions have made similar calls and would urge the department to commence consultation with stakeholders on what such a training programme should include and how it should be conducted. While I recognise the point about an evidence base for this, I think it's pretty intuitive that if someone presently doesn't have the knowledge to meet an autistic student's needs, it stands to reason that they'll be better served when they do. Range of offering. It remains that a significant cohort of students with autism who need autism classes or special schools cannot access them. Parental voice must be considered more in terms of school placement, and teachers in special classes must have advanced training and significant expertise. Student voice. When we talk about training, we must remember that the people best placed to provide insight into their access needs and strengths are autistic students themselves. In our work with young people, we have found that when a student is not consulted on how they are supported, this reduces their self-esteem and their openness to accepting help. Student voice must be built into the individualised planning process for autism, because when you've met one autistic student, you've met one autistic student. Finally, if I may, I would like to highlight a positive example of partnership between educational stakeholders and our own organisation. As I Am, in partnership with the Joint Managerial Body and the Irish Primary Principals Network, has developed a reflective online tool for teachers and schools in order to explore their own practice regarding autism. This will include 3 hours of free online training for every teacher in the country, aimed at a whole school level of understanding. We will pilot this programme with over 200 schools in September. Very often schools and teachers are asked to be autism friendly without a clear or fair picture of what this looks like. We hope this tool and training will help to make that relationship attainable. Teachers can massively improve the lives of autistic students. I know the teachers I had made such a difference in my life. The profession is already doing a lot, but we must put in place supports and standards to ensure that inclusive practice is a universal reality in our education system. Thank you.
Madam, I'd like to open it to the floor for questions. Shane. Sorry, Deputy Cassells.
Thank you very much, Cathaoirleach, and to welcome all of the witnesses here this afternoon. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to have this discussion with the stakeholders, because the issue of parents approaching TDs and senators on a weekly basis in terms of supports for their children is commonplace and becoming more commonplace. So it's a welcome discussion to have and to have in the whole as well. I want to ask a couple of different questions, I suppose, and I'll pose them both at the same time. So in terms of Jim asking in respect of his assessment maybe of what you've heard from Adam, and where there can be common ground found, the experiences that the department would have themselves in terms of hearing from parents and from boards of management for the supports that are needed. And as I said, and maybe an open and frank, I suppose this petitions committee is one where there's more of an atmosphere of conversational style. So I would actually appreciate if maybe Jim could address some of the points that Adam has made and maybe hear from that. In terms of Adam, and you're very welcome, in terms of early on in your statement, you asked or you stated that the quality of experiences was very different across the board. Can I ask you, have you done, and your organisation done, an assessment of the demographics of that? Is that geographically based? Is there a reason for that you've drilled down into to find that different quality of experience? And you mentioned teacher training as well. And just towards the end of your statement, you talked about that all teachers must understand and respect the role. You talked about the 1 in 65 diagnosis, which, as I said, given the experiences that we have on a weekly basis, would certainly stack up. But I suppose just from the point of view of the department, you yourself said there are different needs and different challenges and strengths for each student that would present with a diagnosis. And I suppose therein lies the problem in terms of the requirements for teachers and the challenges that they face. And can I ask, in terms of, you talked about a different set of skills that a teacher requires in terms of that training. Is there a common ground to be met here with the department in facing the challenges that you see and that your organisation deals with? Because it is hugely complex, and we can see it from our work, and we're not trained to deal with it. But I think it's something that both you yourself as an organisation, the department and society in general wants to see a far more welcoming attitude. Because one of the lines that I would disagree with in terms of the petition, where it was stated that our educational system has not changed much from the Industrial Revolution when it was introduced. Well, I can tell you, I can see the education system that my children have today in primary school and the one that I was brought up in. It's a far more welcoming, far more inclusive, far more open system, and one to be welcomed in terms of all children's strengths and weaknesses within the classroom setting. So I think that was an unfair comment in terms of the petition. Those few questions, Cathaoirleach, I just appreciate a response to them.
Who would like to respond first? Adam?
Can I start? Thank you, Deputy. There's a range of issues. You asked me to respond in general to the points that Adam made, and I'd be happy enough to...
just in general, Jim. It's not... Yes.
Just a couple of technical points first. And I should point out that the petition itself related to the experience of children with spectrum disorders. It specifically didn't refer to autism, and I don't get into the personal details of the petitioner's child, but so our comments are broader than just autism. But I acknowledge that that's the avenue we're likely to follow, because autism accounts for the vast, overwhelming majority of children with spectrum disorders within schools. I think we'd agree generally on that. I acknowledge Adam's point about as I am being inundated with requests for training, and I welcome that, frankly, because I think it speaks to something I'm going to say about the willingness of the teaching profession to engage and indeed seek out and access opportunities for learning. And getting away from the traditional language of continuous professional development. I think the experience of what I'm going to speak to now speaks enormously about that. Adam pointed to the NCC's recommendation and in relation to mandatory training for teachers teaching children with autism, and it is the fact that both in 2013 and again in 2015 the NCC made recommendations recommending that there should be mandatory CPD, and in that context work is underway at the moment both within the Teaching Council, within the NCC and collaboratively between the two to develop the framework for CPD so that, you know, I mean, I think we'd all agree that simply for the department to issue a circular saying from next Monday or from the 1st of September it'll be mandatory for teachers to undertake training on autism, that would be not necessarily very effective. You have to develop the training, you have to ensure that the training developed is appropriate, that it recognises the needs and context of children, and also that it's capable of being translated into better practice within the school. And you need a framework then for the evaluation of that. Otherwise it would be meaningless as well. So we fully acknowledge that there is work to be done there. I think the department's concern is that before we get into the space of deciding that there should be a mandatory component on CPD, that we would have the evidence base to underpin that decision, and that's just not there yet, but work is in place. Could I also acknowledge the point made by Adam that Dr. Finn O'Murchu, Head of Education in Mary I in Thurles, St. Pat's and Thurles, has introduced autism in the teacher training courses down there in initial teacher education. That's one good example of practice. Indeed, Finn has a background in the department working with the special education section of it and continues to inform the department of best practice in this particular area, and indeed had a significant engagement with Middletown. So there's a wealth of interagency and activity and engagement and consultation happening around this space all along. Could I make a broader point, Chairperson, and it is this. We've probably come from a difficult enough period, maybe 15, 20 years ago, when there was little in the way of additional provision, when inclusion was not the language of the education system. And in a very rapid period of time, the resources provided to support the inclusion of children in education have been exponentially increased. In my own time in the area of special education, the entire budget went from about 880 million up to 1.8 billion. That was over 10 years of the worst economic depression that the country ever had. Such was the commitment of government and the department to support children's education, and specifically the education of children with special educational needs, and that's seen a huge increase in the numbers of, for example, additional teachers to support special education. We're now at in excess of 15,000. We've just hit 16,000 SNAs from a very low base in the mid-90s of about 300. So about a third of the adult population within schools is specifically related now to special education, and particularly when you add in the number of teachers teaching special classes and the number of teachers teaching special schools. So the investment is huge, and of course that has encouraged a very significant increase in the numbers of children who are being included. And we are working at breakneck pace to try and ensure then that those teachers are supported to ensure that there is best practice within the schools. But of course we'd acknowledge that at a time of very substantial change, that there are always going to be examples where you'll find that the best things are not necessarily happening, where decisions within schools are not necessarily the best decisions around, for example, the assignment of teachers into special classes or the assignment of teachers with the special needs responsibilities. And it's in around those concerns that the NCC have made most of their recommendations around training and qualification structures, and those recommendations are now being actively interrogated in the context of the consultation and development work that the NCC and the Teaching Council are doing. The Teaching Council's exercise, which I referred to in my opening remarks, in engaging with the teaching profession, has satisfied them, and I think we in the department are quite convinced that there is a ready openness on the part of teachers to engage, and it's that openness and willingness to engage in professional learning, including the formal and informal conversations, as I said earlier, within the schools and within the training opportunities that are provided both by the NCC, the Teaching Council, through the education centres, and all of the other training opportunities that are available, including Adam's own ones through As I Am. The willingness to engage in those, that positivity towards it, is what we're trying to sort of identify better, and I suppose to base the future on, rather than simply have a tick box exercise. And I use the words, I suppose, somewhat advisedly, because in preparing for the meeting we looked at, well, where is there evidence of a mandatory CPD programme? And indeed the Medical Council have published their own report on, since the introduction of their mandatory programmes back in 2011, I think it was, where they have indicated that in many respects the mandatory CPD programme for doctors is regarded as a point of argument, a point of contention and a tick box exercise, and doesn't speak to quality of provision. In terms then of ensuring that it translates properly into schools, the department is currently looking at our schools document, which is the document that we use to ensure that schools are self-reflective in terms of their practice, that their understanding of all of the different contexts within their schools, that assignments are conducted appropriately, that leadership and school management is conducted appropriately, and that document speaks significantly about the inclusion of children with special educational needs and indeed other diversity issues, including, for example, disadvantage. And we're currently reviewing that, and we're conscious that there's an opportunity here, bringing all of our service providers, the PDST, the NIPT, who are responsible for induction training of teachers, the JCT, the junior cycle team, and indeed the NCC, bringing everybody together to ensure that there's a coherence between development work and how that translates into best practice within schools. And of course, as you'll know, the inspectorate then is the mechanism through which we look to see how schools are being effective in terms of practice. And inspectors, in the context of full school evaluations, will typically look at what the schools are doing about the implementation of all that good stuff in the looking at our schools document. So there's a lot going on.
Thank you, Jim. Adam, did you want to come in? Or?
Yeah, just in response to some of the things from Deputy Cassells, you asked in relation to, I suppose, where we've seen examples of that differentiation in quality. And I suppose at the first instance, we've probably seen it at a very anecdotal level, in that we do absolutely meet a lot of young people, a lot of families who are having really positive experiences in schools, and will attribute that to the teacher in their class or the teachers in the school. Inversely, through the queries that we're getting through our organisation every month, which is about 70 a month we're receiving from families, consistently in the top 5 issues are school issues. And they're around the support they're receiving within schools. They're to do with the appropriate management of the resources departments are giving them, engagement with parents by teachers, disciplinary processes. To give you an example, at the moment, if a student who's autistic, for example, experiences a meltdown during their school day, very often the policy that's being used to address that isn't a policy around support, it's a disciplinary policy, and it's being dealt with by the same policy that deals with, students who smoke behind the shed, for example. So that's, I think, a big issue. What we particularly have been concerned about is that while there is no doubt a lot of students who are having very positive experiences, we're seeing an increasing number of students not attending school, not having access to a school place, or illegally being placed on reduced timetables. And where that consistently is coming about fundamentally is lack of teacher knowledge. Schools afraid to open autism classes because teachers don't feel that they have the training. Schools that have such classes or have students enrolled in mainstream but maybe aren't in a position to support students as well as they could be. So again, that's really central to it. We published a report in April that documented the cases of 313 children presently out of school called invisible children, and that just represents a very small example of the people in that position. I think in relation to another indicator that I think is important is if you look at schools that have autism classes, there certainly was a vision when such classes were established that students who enrolled in those classes in junior infants increasingly would spend more and more time in mainstream school as time went on. And the evidence is suggesting that children who are enrolled in junior cert or in junior infants very often spend their whole education in such a class, and that to me suggests that not enough is being done around reverse integration and slowly supporting students in entering the autism sphere. Again, I think when we look at what happens to students when they finish school, while some are progressing to university, many are finding themselves in positions where sometimes by the time they finish school, they're very, very socially isolated because they've had negative experiences. I think in terms of the piece around how can teachers manage these varied needs, I think fundamentally what this comes back down to is obviously resources, but then also planning and differentiation. And I mean, the courts have been clear down through the years that people with disabilities having a right to an appropriate education, and that an indicator for that, if you like, is differentiation. And I don't think that's something that's particularly, I suppose, new in terms of what we're talking about, because the established policy of the state is that in the vast majority of instances, students with disabilities should attend mainstream school. I think the difficulty is that often, while that's the established policy, schools then aren't being supported enough, or also aren't being regulated enough in terms of delivering that service. And again, just to bring up the whole issue of the UNCRPD is very clear in saying that it's never the case that a child needs to change or needs to adapt to go to school, but rather it's incumbent on member states and their agencies, in this case schools, to actually ensure that the service they operate is accessible. And I think what that kind of brings me back to is this piece about mandatory CPD and the training for it, because while I certainly recognise that there might be a need for an evidence body for an overall mandatory CPD programme, if we don't have mandatory CPD, this is literally the equivalent of asking somebody who doesn't speak French to go in and teach a French class. Fundamentally, autism is a completely different way of doing and seeing things, and to place a person in a classroom without that knowledge and insight is setting everybody up for a failure. And I think that's the evidence base. To come back to the language example, there is examples in the education system presently of non-verbal autistic children whose SNA and teachers do not have the training to use the alternative communication style they might use. So that just highlights how urgent an issue this is, I think.
Chairperson, can I just ask one very follow-up question, just in response to what Adam said there, in terms of children being illegally placed on reduced hours and sent home. I've had 2 cases of such practices 2 months ago from 2 separate schools close to each other in a rural setting. And can I ask Jim, just in terms of cases such as that, where the schools are sending home children who, on the basis that they cannot cope, but their parents are being told to collect them. What is the process for reporting of such incidents and the follow-up and the support then being offered to the school and that being followed up professionally to make sure that that practice is actually not allowed to continue? Because as I said, I've had 2 instances of that alone in the last month in County Meath.
So, just to say that this was an issue that was raised at an Oireachtas committee in the last couple of days. Eddie spoke on it, so maybe Eddie might like to answer it.
Yeah, I think there is obviously an evidence-based support in the use of reduced timetables out there, and there seems to be some confusion about how the issue should be managed, both at a local level and at a national level. It is very clear from a department's point of view that every child is entitled to receive a full education. And if there are examples, or if there are situations where children, because of their medical need or because of some other pressing need, which is supported by expert evidence, that needs to be curtailed for any reason, it should be part of a plan about which the parent is consulted, that there should be a timely engagement about that there should be defined objectives as to what the outcome of the plan is, and it's very clearly over time. It should be reviewed, and it shouldn't happen as a surprise to the parent that they're just being called and just said, called in to bring their child home on a recurring basis. There should be very clearly a response. There are support services available to help schools around individual children. There's the National Educational Psychological Service, for example, and there may be others. On the legal side of it, it's clear that under the Education Welfare Act that there is a reporting obligation, there is an obligation on schools to record attendance and to report on non-attendance. Where a child is sent home, about which there's no consultation, and where there's a kind of it's not part of an educational intervention, to put it like that, that technically is a suspension. That should be recorded and it should be reported to TUSLA. And they have guidelines and a range of interventions in place through their Educational Welfare Service for that to be followed up. And I think that might just deal with that. Just on a broader space, I suppose, and Adam makes very valid points about school culture and about teachers' competence. The OECD did a piece of work a number of years ago, and they talked about that the quality of teaching in a school cannot exceed the quality of the teachers. And that is something that is very central to department policy making and thinking in recent times, and the whole emphasis on how we address that from a strategic and a policy point of view. The establishment of the Teaching Council was a very strategic move in order to, I suppose, guarantee what we, in terms of quality, what we now call the continuum of teacher education, which governs the initial teacher education piece, which right through to bridging the initial teacher education piece into teaching, and then career-long professional development. The whole thrust of policy is that should be evidence-based throughout, and obviously it's very much about bringing the profession with us. But there's clearly, a bit to go on that. But an awful lot of work has been done. All the initial teacher education programmes, of which there are quite a few, they have all been reviewed and been reconfigured since 2012. And in the NCSE review that Jim referenced a little while ago, there was clear evidence in terms of these programmes, including having an inclusive modules included in it. Now, there may be some work to be done again on that, and clearly the work of Mary I is going to be useful in that. But I think it's safe to say that the Council in its work is being very much driven by what is state's policy, what is international best practice, and where are our needs currently. In other words, we want to meet the needs of our children that are in school today. We clearly need to be responding to that and picking up on the work of our inspectorate and the work of Adam and his organisation. The other strategic piece that the department did was to establish the National Council for Special Education. And this was an intervention designed, again, to address, I suppose, a lacuna in the department's ability to respond to the needs of children with special education, and to make sure that the department, in responding, was doing it on a very reliable evidence base. And Jim outlined some of the statistics there in terms of the work that's been done. But I think it's very clear that the commitment to supporting children with special education needs and spectrum disorders is, I don't think it can be second-guessed, because it's absolutely very clear in terms of what has happened since 2011, in particular the number of special needs teachers, the numbers of SNAs, and I suppose the variety of supports that are going into schools. The emphasis on training, I think, can be understated, and I think that's very clear in terms of the advices that have been referenced here already that we've been getting from the NCSE, and I think you will see more on that. We know, that last year something of the order of 15,000 teachers were trained on special education in general terms. Now, there are further statistics if you want to break that down, but I think that's kind of a very clear statement in its own right of the commitment of the state to support the upskilling of teachers. We have made a number of other kind of innovative moves on the advice of the NCSE as well. Currently, there is a school inclusion model in development, which will see a range of new therapies being brought into schools. It's happening in 75 schools currently, and will be piloted for a further year. And it's about bringing in occupational therapy, speech and language, and behavioural practitioners into schools, so that we support teachers in a way that they haven't been supported before. Because, while special needs assistants are doing a magnificent job, clearly they don't have the skills and competencies in some of the areas where children, exhibiting needs in school need to be supported. And the outcome of this pilot will, I suppose, further inform policy into the future as to how we might extend that model. So, I suppose, in summary, the point I'm making is that we recognise that there is an increased need out there, that our understanding and knowledge is building the whole time, and that we're busily trying to catch up, given that resources are not unlimited. Currently, there's I think almost 20% of the total education vote being spent on supporting special needs, and and that investment will grow. We need to be sure that we are doing it based on good, sound evidence, and I think that's our intention. And teacher education and training, in generally, has to be central to that.
Thank you, Eddie. You wanted to come in there briefly, Adam?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly speak to the piece around reduced timetables, because this is something we're seeing a huge amount of. And as has been said, and I think this is fair to say, there is instances where parents are comfortable with reduced timetables. They feel it actually helps their child. It's better to go to school for part of the day than not go to school at all. The bit that really concerns us is where these are imposed unilaterally by a school. And there seems to be a situation where there's been a real culture of secrecy around that. And indeed, certainly in the surveys we've done, where at times the reduced timetables have been put in place in a very coercive manner, i.e. if you do not accept this, we'll be looking at suspension or expulsion. But I think what came out at last week's Oireachtas committee I think is very important, which is that TUSA have clarified a reduced timetable is a suspension. And I think the question has to be asked is, why are schools not being written to and informed of this?
Thank you.
Deputy Buckley.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks very much for your honesty and some of the clarities. And Mr. Ward, I'll go to you first, because again, I have many cases here with people with children with special needs, and they are having problems. And you said about schools having programmes and stuff. Are you speaking about a national programme, as in a national rule for schools, or is it based on the fact, and we all know that some schools that will perform better than others, and it depends on, I suppose, the cooperation between teachers and principals, for better supports for people in school? And also, The Middletown Centre came up a number of times, and I was lucky enough to go to the Middletown Centre last year with a number of colleagues from the Sinn Féin party, and we had a very, very, I suppose, frank discussion on this, and the fact that, yes, they do support, I suppose, the industry, as we'll call it, but from the reaction I got from them, they actually want to do more. They're like people that are chomping at the bit, and we know it's it's co-funded by the Department of Education in England and here. Is there any way, because they spoke of how to encourage schools, right? Which was a very, I suppose, cute word to be using, but to encourage through an accreditation system, where you're actually inviting the schools to come along and say, look, we have so many pupils in our school, we know there's so many more coming down. Is there a way that you can assist us to upskill our teachers without putting extra pressure on those? Because as you mentioned yourself, it is an issue of resources. It's also an issue of forward planning. But from what I got from the Middletown Centre, they have the system to move forward. We need the government to buy into that system to kind of co-fund it, we'll call it. And then the plus side is people as a whole want to do the right thing, and it's a normal reaction to help people if they're in difficulty, regardless what it is. But if you encourage a school to help their teachers to upskill, the obvious knock-on effect of that is that the quality of school life for everybody improves, plus the fact with the accreditation, you're actually acknowledging, and I think it's something that we lose a lot in any system in this country, is we don't actually acknowledge the good work from people and what they do. Would it be a system you'd be interested? And you were on about cohesion and tying all that up. Is there a way that you can all tie in to that? And I mean, as I said, with the Middletown Centre, and it's kind of very weird because I'm from Middleton, which is very strange. And it used to be called Middletown a long time ago. But with the Middletown Centre, I feel that they seem to be totally non-judgmental. They've looked at the 32 county sphere when it comes to education, and it is between honesty with them. But I'm just saying, would it be a way of joined up thinking, because we've seen it in a lot of organisations where they all want to do the right thing, but they're all doing it differently.
Yeah.
So I suppose my initial question would be, would you look at it as tying in, if this is the only 32, I suppose, autism specialist centre, could we not tie in with the educational boards on both sides of the water? Because, well, bar whatever happens with Brexit, but they are working together. Surely they can come up with a plan, and I think the accreditation model would be the one that would benefit everybody. I'm just saying, what's your opinion on that?
I think the department is working closely with Middletown as it stands. We view Middletown as a centre for excellence on autism, and I think we want to work with them, and we have a programme of work with them at the moment, and they work with the NCSE, and they deliver programmes for us. I think they'll be very closely involved as we go forward. I know, for example, that we're currently looking at a training programme for schools that are establishing a special class for the first time this September. They will be involved along with our own NEPS, the National Education Psychological Service, and the NCSE in developing that programme. And I don't want to preempt how the delivery might work out, but very clearly we're involving them more and more in terms of our thinking and our policy making, our planning, and certainly they're already involved in delivery. So yes, I mean, they have an expertise and that we don't have in ready supply, and we will be drawing on that. I should just say, put on the record as well, that in overall terms, the department spends about 50 million a year on teacher education. And that, covers the whole piece of employing of teachers to develop programmes, to deliver, to pay for substitute teachers back in the base school, and the whole lot of expenditures involved. So it is a significant expenditure. We know it's going to grow. A lot of it is to do with new curriculum innovation, other things that happen within a school, the introduction of mandatory child protection guidelines, all of that. So there is a lot going on, but clearly the whole issue of special needs and spectrum disorders is a very clear priority, and we're very much aware of kind of the increased need as we see it and how we respond to that. Again, the Deputy refers to resources, and I suppose as a good official I should refer to it as well every now and again. It is a question of balancing priorities, but we take the point very much on board. Middletown have an expertise, and we certainly will be utilising that.
Yeah, I think just to pick up on a couple of pieces that you said, certainly I think that not reinventing the wheel piece is particularly important, especially because schools are getting so many new initiatives and everything at the moment. So in the resource that we've developed that I referenced, we've used the Middletown framework, the Autism Education Trust framework, and all of the relevant departmental policies, so that it's not something new, it's just making something a bit more cohesive. But what I do just want to say is in relation to the piece of accreditation, I think that's an interesting point, because as an organisation we would accredit lots of different organisations, universities, shops, businesses around being autism friendly. We've been reluctant to do it for schools, and there's a reason for it. We'd very much like to do it, but if you just kind of look at a particular pattern that's happening that's very worrying, which is in a geographical area, sometimes what's happening is one school stepping forward and saying, we'll do the right thing, we'll open a special class, we want to be inclusive. And every time one school steps back, all the others take 2 steps backwards, or steps forward, the other 2 takes 2 steps backwards. And what we're slightly concerned about at the moment, now hopefully the school admissions bill will address this somewhat with the being able to designate areas for autism classes, is that there's a bit of ghettoisation going on, so to speak, where one school takes all of the children with special needs and is kind of mandated as the school that's good at that, instead of recognising that every school has a role to play in it. And I think it's worth saying as a result that league tables and the media in that regard have a really negative impact in terms of the outcomes for autistic students, because they define that the only good school is a school that does well in the league tables, as opposed to a school that works for everybody. So I'd love to do an accreditation, but I think the worry is that it will designate a school as the only school that does this. So,
no, thank you very much. Thank you.
Is that okay? Oh yes, sorry, Jim.
On that, firstly, we'd agree entirely about the risk to school league tables, and because of that, we'd be very anxious to avoid anything that would be pointing to the schools that are doing well, and conversely to the schools that are regarded as not doing very well. The Deputy mentioned issues around school programmes, and I think it's important to point out that there are lots of programmes in place to support teachers who are working with children with autism, with spectrum disorders, and indeed with a range of other special educational needs, and they are supported typically through the provision provided by the NCSE, and that work in developing those programmes is informed by Middletown. So Middletown they're significantly part of a much bigger joined-up process, and everything they do informs the development work around all of this. That's the development work that the NCSE are doing, and also the development work indeed that Mary I are involved in their particular programme. And Fiona Murrock, who was involved while he was within the inspectorate, as he was involved in the major inspection of the Middletown model, so he'd be very familiar with it. So again, there's a lot of joined up on that. In terms of encouraging schools, I'd have to say from my own experience that the difficult bit is to encourage schools to get to the starting point, to open the class, to enrol the child. But my experience is that once the schools have opened the class, then there's a real willingness, and their engagement from then on is wholehearted, because they see the benefits. They see it working, and they see, look, there's supports in place. It's not always perfect, but they see it working. They see the impact they're having on the life of the child. They see the improvements for every other child in the school who begins to understand that the world is not a homogenous world that they live in, and an inclusive school is much, much better for all of the children in the school, not just the children with special education needs.
Lovely, thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Deputy Buckley. I might just make a few comments myself then before we wrap up. I suppose, I've spoke obviously about this area a few times, especially at the Education Committee. And I think just listening to the presentations today, I suppose I'm more making a point than asking questions, but feel free to comment, is that we're continuing to see what should be a normal way of teaching within a diverse system as something additional. So we're taking that everybody in a room must learn the same, except for this one person that might possibly be on the spectrum or is diagnosed as being on the spectrum, instead of acknowledging that actually mandatory training or a general training scheme for teachers to understand that even if someone doesn't, if you're not aware that someone has a diagnosis in the room, or they're not aware that they should have a diagnosis, that you should be informed and trained in a way that you teach on the assumption that you should teach in a particular way, regardless of whether you have X, Y, Z on your papers as needing special attention or special education. I think as a mother of someone on the spectrum, navigating the school system was really, really difficult for her. And there could have been very simple things within the mainstream system that could have made that life a lot easier for her. Now, looking at some children that end up on reduced timetables, especially due to the tiredness and the emotional drain that it takes to navigate a school day when you're having to have that narrator in your head of what you're supposed to do next and how you're going to find your way to a classroom, and everybody moves into the corridors at the one time and stuff, or even the teacher that's sitting at the top of the room constantly clicking a pen and not being aware that actually the impact that that's having on someone in the room is, like, you know, I think there's very simple things that could be done to stop reduced timetables, because actually it's the environment that's creating the anxiety, you know, rather than the person's diagnosis. It's the environment, it's the response to them, it's the learning style that they're not receiving, you know, the whole idea around verbal instruction and how we provide people with information on how to carry out their homework or whatever. And I just think that the problem is that we keep seeing it as additional too. So every single piece of teacher training, regardless of what module it is, regardless of what year in your teacher training is, should have a thread through each of them, you know, so it should just naturally include that different people learn in different ways. And actually, if you were to teach in a room, right? Now maybe this is not true, but I'm going to make the assumption. If you were to teach in the room as if everyone had autism, right? As if everyone did, I think it'd actually be a much nicer learning environment for most people, because you're taking into account that some people will have sensory issues, or some people will have a different way of receiving information, and you just teach on the assumption that everybody is different in the classroom. And I think that's where we're failing a little bit in terms of special ed, because we keep seeing it as an add-on, and I think the accreditation would unfortunately do that as well. So I'm just wondering, do either of you see a space where we need to actually completely transform teacher training in general to actually be more reflective of Irish society, rather than having to keep finding these add-ons, and you know, what impact would that have?
I certainly agree with that, and I think partly as well something that is beginning to happen, but maybe not enough, is one of the things that I've been delighted to see in visiting a few teaching training colleges to give talks the last while. I've had the pleasure of actually meeting student teachers who themselves are on the autism spectrum. I think that's going to be so important in ultimately shifting the profession and moving it away from one type of person teaching other types of people, that it's a more inclusive profession overall. I think the point you make is really important, because we talk about universal design and universal design for learning. The problem is, when a lot of these kind of frameworks were developed, autism was still addressed as a medical issue, and it wasn't seen as part of that. And I even see that, as I briefly alluded to earlier, in how school buildings are being built at the moment. They're incredibly accessible, wide corridors. They're less accessible for autistic students than they ever were, for a range of reasons. So I think there's a need to embed autistic people into the universal design process, recognising that it's not about charity, it's not really about special ed, it's about a diversity issue, and it's about embedding that culture, I think.
Thank you.
Could I add, I mean, I'm not surprised to hear you say, make the point that, you know, certainly it was true in the past that the classroom was such that, you know, teaching was teaching, and, you know, teaching the child with autism was different, but everything else was uniform within that, and almost as if the child with autism was inconvenient. A lot of work was done in this particular space around the introduction of the new model, the new resource teacher model, back in 2017, and it took many years to get us to a place where we could introduce that. And introducing the new model about the distribution of teachers was one small part of that. The major part of it was changing the approach to teaching within schools, which now informs, of course, teacher training. And a lot of that was around the identification of pupils with additional needs, moving away from a model which relied entirely on a diagnosis, because frankly, a diagnosis of autism is telling the teacher really nothing about the needs of the child. Every child with autism is different, as indeed are the needs of every child who is deaf and hard of hearing, blind, visually impaired, child with ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, lots of different needs in there. And, so it was very important that we would have a model which would encourage the school to have a better understanding of the learning needs of the children, and then to develop planning. And we issued very substantial guidance to all schools, to all teachers around the introduction of that new model. And we also issued circulars around the distribution of teaching resources and what they'd be used for. And if I may just read one small part of it, under the heading of additional teaching support in the circular in 2017 for, I think this was primary schools, the classroom teacher in consultation with the special educational teacher as required will consider ways in which the curriculum can be differentiated or adapted to suit the needs of individual pupils. This may also involve identifying the most appropriate teaching strategies and programmes to meet the child's needs and deciding what or which additional teaching supports are required. Parents should normally be consulted as part of this process. Now, that was a radical move from where we were, where essentially the needs of the children were being negotiated between the parents and the NCSE, and the response was we'll provide a couple of hours teaching and some SNA support. This was now a discussion around the learning needs of the child in a way that wasn't really happening up until then, but is happening now and is informing the teaching, the differentiated teaching practices of teachers. So a teacher now in a classroom should understand the learning needs of all of the children within the classroom, whether or not they have autism or Down syndrome or moderate learning difficulties or whatever. They should understand the need, they have the supports there to work with them, and they should plan to teach the child in respect of those needs, and they should plan in consultation with the parents. And that's what our teacher training and continuous professional development efforts are now trying to support.
Okay, thank you, Jim.
Just to say, that I mean, I think we recognise that the department can come up with great policies and strategies, but there can be a gap in terms of when it comes to implementation at a local level. And I think the point has been made maybe more than once around what the school culture is. And school culture very often, can take time to move it, and I suppose it's a kind of a constant thing through training, through information, through leadership development, that we actually, get agents of change active across the system at every level of the system. And I don't exclude the department from that, but I think it's kind of a challenge, and I suppose. Over the time that I've been in the department, we have certainly moved in terms of the provision of special education, which we've talked about. We have moved in terms of curriculum development. And just to say, in terms of curriculum development, there are strands of that are focused around differentiated learning and teaching in the classroom. Like I know, for example, in the new primary language curriculum that was introduced in the last number of years, there would have been very dedicated aspects of the training to help teachers in the different environments that they might be in. The other thing in a kind of a school context, and I think, is about the quality of relationships within the school, and and how that's done. And I mean, it's the point that Adam makes, I think, kind of refer to that. Clearly, the voice of the student and the voice of the child, it's something, again, I think that we have to value more and more, because there's great learning from that. And I think the fact that we are we have ways and means of beginning to capture that evidence. Our inspectorate model are increasingly, consulting with parents and families around their experience. The agencies that we have in place, the teaching councils, the NCSE, through their work, we're actually beginning to focus on that more and more. So. I mean, a change of its nature is going to take time. And obviously, if you think you've achieved one goal, obviously there's 4 or 5 more on the horizon at any given time. And there's a progression here, and I suppose as human beings, this is going to be a lifelong challenge. But I think a lot of work has been done, and but there's more to do.
Okay, thank you, Eddie. So that concludes the meeting, and I'd like to thank the Tregas for coming here today. The petition will remain open, so the committee will meet to deliberate on the evidence that's been heard, and we'll follow up at a later stage. So, thank you.
Thank you.
So just give them a minute before I move into this. Just go straight away?
Straight away.
All right, Grant. So we'll move on to consideration of public petitions. The committee will now make formal Formal decisions on 6 petitions. Petition P0001519 from Ms Taylor. This petition would like to see Irish citizenship offered to all British spouses of Irish nationals who are currently resident in Ireland and have been married for over 5 years. This petition cites the uncertainty of Brexit and potential hardships to British citizens as the reason to do this. Does any member wish to contribute to this matter? No. So the decision made in relation to this petition is, or will I propose the decision to be that we forward a copy of the response from the Department of Justice and Equality to the petitioner and close the petition. Is that agreed? Agreed. Petition 60001619 from Ms Molly O'Brien. This petition would like to see visa exemptions for non-EU spouses of Irish citizens in the case of short-stay visits only. The petition cites the excessive documentation required for the application and the lead-in time required in this application process. This is the first of 2 petitions by the same petitioner on a similar theme. Does any member wish to contribute on this matter?
Chair.
I propose that we forward a copy of the response from the Department of Justice and Equality to the petitioner and close the petition. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Petition P002419, Ms Laura Moore. This petition would like to see the immediate end to all badger culling and the implementation of a TB vaccine programme for badgers. The petition states that a vaccination programme was proposed by the Government in 2018 but has not been actioned. Does any member wish to contribute to the matter?
No, Chair.
So I propose that we keep this petition open. Yes?
Please.
Okay, thank you. And we'll forward a copy of the response from the Department of Agriculture. No? Oh, sorry. Yeah. Excuse me. So we correspond further with the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine, asking for further details on the rollout of the vaccination programme, including a timeline, and correspond with the petitioner, informing them that the petition remains open. Is that agreed? Petition P0001519 from Mr Joseph Guerin. The petitioner objects to an official visit to the state by dignitaries and cites security fears. Does any member wish to contribute to this matter?
No, Chair.
I propose that we deem this petition inadmissible as per standing orders of the committee, and the standing order that I am referring to is 111C, Section 1. And it is Section 1A, request the Dáil to do anything other than the Dáil has the power to do. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Petition P003019 from Ms Molly O'Brien. This petition considers the documentation required in the Irish visa application process. Specifically, the petitioner references the 6 months of bank statements required from the applicant, which they consider a breach of privacy. As the alternative, this petition suggests a certificate of balance, which would show the balance of the applicant's account on a certain date. Does any member wish to contribute to this matter?
Chair.
I propose that we forward a copy of the response from the Department of Justice and Equality to the petitioner and close the petition. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
So I'm moving on to 6.6 then, yes? Petition number P001118, mandatory training for Irish mainstream school teachers, children on spectrum disorders, Josephine Bowles. This petition would like to see mandatory training to all primary and post-primary mainstream teachers in various elements of spectrum disorders. This would include autism, Asperger's syndrome, dyspraxia, DCD, ADHD, sensory processing order. Does any member wish to contribute to this matter?
No, Chair.
So we are just agreeing to keep this one open, is it? Yeah? So I propose that we forward a copy of the official report of the meeting and documents supplied by the Department, and as I am, to the petitioner, and also inform that the petition remains open.
Agreed.
Agreed. Thank you. So thank you for your attendance to the meeting today. I propose that the committee adjourn until Wednesday, the 3rd of July at 3rd of July 2019 at 1:30 p.m. Is this agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
I did. All right, so the committee is now adjourned until Wednesday, the 3rd of July 2019 at 1:30 p.m. Thank you.